Hello and welcome to the introduction to Module 4 of International Business, and we're going to talk about what you're expected to do in the module on national culture. Once again, these slides have drawn from my own resources, but also from Hill and Holt. The objectives of Module 4 are to enable students to identify what is meant by culture and how that meaning has evolved, to identify and discuss the key determinants of culture, to identify and discuss the implications of the differences in culture for international business, to discuss the influence of culture on business practices, and to identify and discuss the implications of cultural change for international business. So what do you need to do in Module 4? A couple of issues about the structure. That Friday the 10th is Good Friday and there's no class. That Friday the 17th is the trimester break, so there's no class. So I've structured it so all activities for this module can be undertaken online, though there are some things that we're going to be doing in the Zoom workshop on the 24th of April. So the Zoom workshop on the 24th of April will focus on reviewing activities related to Assignment 1, which will include the activities related to Assignment 1, the question on culture, and also we'll set up groups for Assignment 2. Now, this Assignment 1 reflection will be our theory to practice activity that you need to prepare for the assignment as well. I've got the usual drop-in sessions at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, and I've scheduled extra drop-in sessions for 1 p.m. Tuesday the 14th and Friday the 17th. Note that those drop-in sessions now require a password. The password is in an announcement. The password is also in the Moodle website up the top where you can find the link to log in. It's part of the new security process that Zoom has put into place. The activities you've got to do in this module are a determinants of culture activity, which is part of reviewing key concepts, and a models of culture activity. So both of those activities are review of key concepts, and a theory to practice activity, which is a country comparison activity. So by the 17th of April, what we want you to do is to look at the determinants of culture model. The determinants of culture model I'm going to talk about just in a few minutes after I've done this initial introduction. The slides related to the determinants of culture model also appear as the workshop slides. So what we're going to do is look at the impact that cultural culture has on international business, and to do that we need to understand first our own culture. Because if we're going to interact cross-culturally with other people from a different culture, we need to understand our culture before we can understand their culture. So the activity that I want you to do for the first forum is to use the determinants of culture model to and comment on at least how two of these determinants of culture have changed over time in your country. That's for your culture. Why have I asked you to look at over time? The determinants of culture model is a model of culture that draws from sociology. The determinants of culture model recognizes that cultures change over time. Cultures evolve. So looking at some of the things that determine the nature of culture and how they've changed over time will help you reflect on on your own understanding of culture. The second Moodle activity looks at a psychology-based, or a model that draws from psychology. It's a model that's measuring culture, which is Hofstede's model. I'm sure you've already done Hofstede's model. In the past, Hofstede's model began as a 4-dimension model of individualism and collectivism, power distance, masculinity and femininity, that was later updated to be called quantity and quality of life, and uncertainty avoidance. A 5th dimension was added after research in China about long-term orientation, and a sixth dimension was added more recently about indulgence and restraint. So what I want you to do for that activity is visit the 6 Dimensions of Hofstede's National Culture website. That's the official website of Gerd Hofstede. His son's also called Gerd Hofstede, I think. No, his son's called Jan Hofstede. That's right. Gerd Hofstede's in his 80s or older, and Jan is the person running this particular continuation of his research. Review each video, come to class, which means you're going to post this on, come to class ready to discuss the dimension, which means I want you to post onto the unit website your discussion of that item. So that's the forum posts activities, and that forum post is by 24th of April. Post it to the forum, comment on to other students' posts. The reason you need to come to class ready for it is that in the Zoom tutorial, we're going to be looking at a comparison of the culture of 2 countries, and I've asked you to use one model, and I've said you can use the countries that you've going to use in your first assignment. So if you've done this activity, you should be well versed in one model, Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions model, to use that to analyse and answer the question on the assignment and in the discussion in the Zoom tutorial on the 24th. Right, so let's look at some background of these 2 models. I'm not going to lecture the whole lecture online. It would normally be broken up into multiple parts. I just want to give you a feeling for the determinants of culture model and a brief introduction to Hofstede, but I'm sure that you've all been exposed to Hofstede before, as it's the dominant business model. So, the 2 models we're talking about, the 2 views on culture. The first view on culture is the determinants of culture model. It's based on sociology and allied fields. It's about describing how culture evolves from past to present for individuals in a cultural group. Can be applied to business settings. It's not a model that has, or not a structure that has measurement. And a lot of businesses or business theory, business academics require measurement, particularly those that are rooted in social psychology, organizational psychology, and broader management research, so quantitative research. So there's several models of culture that are based on measuring cultural characteristics or cultural dimensions or factors, and then using that as a proxy for the national culture. One of those, the dominant model, the model that's been around for the longest, the model that's cited the most, is Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions model. I mentioned in the intro that started as a 4-dimension model. It's moved up to a 6-dimension model. But there are other models, for example, Globe. When we're operating in business, cross-cultural literacy is important because differences in culture, differences in values and norms influence the way we interact. Our assumptions of differences in values and norms influence the way we interact. So we've given you some definitions of culture, or some description of the schools of thought of culture, but there are many competing definitions. But broadly, they all talk about it being a shared group of assumptions about how things should be, a set of rules of behaviour. And we have to recognise in national culture, there's likely to be, inside a country, multiple cultures, differences based on other factors other than just a geographical area like Australia or Thailand or the United States. That shouldn't be surprising, because when we talk about culture more broadly in some of the other management topics you've talked about, they talk about organisational culture and professional culture, the differences between, say, accountants and marketers. the differences between organisations. So you could describe culture as any category, any grouping of people and the way they believe things ought to be, the way things need to be done round here. And therefore, even in organisations, you may get dominant and subdominant, or differences in professional cultures within an organisation. Culture's about values. Culture's about norms, which is the rules that govern people's actions. And culture in the nation state does not have strictly a one-to-one relationship with the country that you're in. Nation states are political creations. Nations can have several different cultures. That wraps that loop that I've just talked about. So let's identify and discuss briefly the determinants of culture model. This is our sociological model. The determinants of culture model says there are 6 things that determine the norms and values of a culture. Religion, education, political philosophy, economic philosophy, social structure, and language. So let's look at some of those and how they might play out. Well, let's look at all of those and how they might play out. We talked about political philosophy and economic philosophy in the previous 2 models. We talked about how those things determine the way a society operates. So I'm going to focus today on religion, education, language, and social structure as the determinants of culture that we're interested in for this week. Right, social structure, the first of those. Social structure is the basic social organisation. It's about individuals, it's about classes, it can be stratified into classes and castes, but it's also about mobility. All societies have some type of stratification. Individuals can be born into a particular strata, a particular level. Some of those stratas are based on long histories of rules. India's caste system, for example. The UK's class system. Long history of rules that are about traits that are perceived in society for particular groups. It carries on from generation to generation. It evolves as a universal concept but is variable within societies, and it involves not just about equity and inequity, but are about belief systems of different groups, different stratas in society, or perceptions of those belief systems, what you think about others' behaviour. I want to emphasise social mobility, and I want to emphasise that we're giving this as a broad structure. We could broadly say that India has 4 castes, and that there is limited mobility between those. There are barriers to mobility. One of the reasons that people move countries, where you get an overseas Indian community, is because they're removing themselves from a particular stratification of culture. A class system is more open, and the position can be achieved by luck or changed. But in some cases, for example in Thailand, which has a very strong class system, it used to have something called the Sakdina system, which set the level of a person almost by number. But you can move up and down that class system by education, for example. So it's a more flexible class system than what has traditionally existed in India. Now, I know that in modern India, there's lots of efforts to break and ban and remove caste and class barriers, just like there are in many countries to break and remove social class barriers or barriers based on racial groupings and so forth. But broadly, social mobility is part of the determinants of culture, which modifies social stratification. Religion and other ethical systems also determine the values within a society. I want to emphasize other ethical systems because religion does not have and is not the only ethical structure by which people may live by. And in another course, I'm sure you're going to be dealing with ethics and governance and accountability across society. People with a shared language may have similarities in culture, but that shared language doesn't necessarily mean they do have that similarity of culture. The biggest English-speaking country in the world is India. People speak Spanish in Mexico and Spain and a whole other pile of countries in South America. Is the culture in East Timor because they speak Portuguese the same as the culture in Portugal? No, there may be links, there may be crossovers. But the spoken language, even if you are speaking the same language, doesn't mean you're communicating the same thing. Just in English, if you table a document in the US, the phrase table document, the idiom table document, means put aside to deal with later. In the UK, it means, well, that's considered and accepted. In Australia, it almost depends which meeting you're at, what it means. Beyond spoken language, there's also non-verbal communication, which is often culturally banned and is about personal space in part. Eye contact is very important to many English speakers, there are several other cultural groups where eye contact is not important. In fact, it's seen as aggressive. So people who are from a culture where eye contact is important may believe that people who don't look them in the eye are lying to them, which would therefore affect communication. Similarly, people who come from a culture where eye contact is not a sign of respect and communication may feel that they are being bullied by people who maintain too much eye contact. So language is a determinant and it influences the way we interpret culture. And depending on the society, education moves people up and down the social strata of a country, and how freely that happens depends on both education as the determinant and other determinants, but also education sometimes enables mobility, so you're moving people from one culture to another cultural environment, and they'll adapt to that culture, and their children may bring a whole new integrated culture and help the culture they've moved to evolve and change. So what are the implications of differences of culture for international business? For the determinants of culture, what we see that for groups, in many Western societies, the individual is the basic building block of social organisation, while in some other non-Western cultures, group membership and identification is the most important component. Social mobility varies. People's acceptance of class. That can be as simple as, look, to use an anecdote from a person who's worked often overseas, it's very important in particular countries in Asia that you stay at a very good hotel, because that creates a particular social strata when you're communicating with the people you're trying to negotiate with. Now, I know that sounds a bit superficial, but it's about demonstrating that you are from a social strata that enables you to deal with the people from that. So you're not an unimportant person from your organisation. Religion and work ethics and the spirit of capitalism and engagement and Confucian work ethics and long and short-term orientations can also be influenced by religion and ethical systems. And I'll let you read some of the descriptions that come from the textbook of those things. And finally, common language can help you share business practices. High and low context languages, however, change the way that you communicate. And I'll just talk about that briefly in a moment. And you get unintended meanings even if you are dealing across culture. High context languages are languages where you work are often languages that have a few verb tenses. So you've got to infer what the tense and what the meaning is from the concept of what is being said. Thai, most Chinese languages, most Sanskrit-based languages are high context languages. Now, if you're from the West, if you're from England and you speak English or any of the Romantic languages, even any of the Germanic languages, what you see is, if you see something written, verbs and failure to use the correct verb tense has a far greater impact than mucking up or making mistakes in other forms of communication, because the verb tense is very important. It's a high context, highly detailed language. So contracts need to be very detailed. Sorry, that's a low contract language. So contracts need to be detailed because you want everything specified. And that's what low context languages are. Languages that specify everything. Languages that have a lot of detail. Languages that have a lot of verb tenses. If you've ever listened to a Russian translator, you'll find that they speak very slowly in the first part of the translation and very fast at the end. That's because the structure of the sentences in Russian put all the action words at the end, so you don't know what the sentence means in English, which, has a subject and an object and an action word and a link, until you've heard the whole sentence. So they rush it at the end and they're speaking slowly at the beginning so that the translation makes sense. You can also get a range of unintended meanings just from the different ways that people use words, even slang words, for example. And I've mentioned that education influences economic activity. In previous weeks we've talked about that, and that the ability to move across social strata varies. Okay, so that's my introduction to the week and also to the determinants of culture model. I'm going to record something separately discussing Hofstede, but note that most of the things that you need to do for Hofstede come from watching those videos rather than referring back to your textbook. Okay, see you in the drop-in session during the week, if you need to talk to me during the week. And the next time I'll see you is in the Zoom tutorial is the Friday the 24th of April.